Welcome to Breaking the Set. I'm Abby Martin. So yesterday, the world witnessed a truly horrific tragedy unfold in eastern Ukraine. A Malaysian airliner was shot down, killing 298 human beings on board. Many of the passengers were humanitarians on their way to an AIDS conference in Australia. Unfortunately, the media coverage from all sides has been truly disappointing. Within hours, the Sun immediately declared the missile as Putin's, and neocons were given a platform across corporate media to seize upon the tragedy and resurrect Cold War fervor, urging the West to, quote, confront the Russian regime. Look, speculation on all sides in the mere hours after any large-scale disaster is abhorrent, irresponsible journalism, and does a great disservice to the 298 victims of this crime who lost their lives. But as of the time of this broadcast, here's what we know. The plane was shot down by what appears to be a surface-to-air missile over the war-torn area of Donetsk, near the Russian border. This is an area rife with violence between Ukrainian forces and separatist fighters ever since the coup and subsequent incursion into Crimea. And just like the U.S. giving support to the tune of $5 billion on the ground in Ukraine, Russia has been logistically backing the rebels in this territory, according to NATO officials. If an international independent investigation does indeed find that the missile was shot by rebel fighters, then the criminals responsible need to be held accountable. To be clear, we don't know yet how these people got a hold of the weapons. But if the investigation finds that this missile was indeed Russian, then it exemplifies exactly why state powers should not be providing high-grade weaponry to militias anywhere in the world. Just yesterday, I covered how nearly every world conflict can be traced back to the U.S. military, whether it be tear gas canisters in Egypt, Bahrain, banned dime weapons in Israel, massive artillery launchers that ISIS just stole 52 of in Iraq, and guns in the hands of al-Qaeda in Syria. When things like this happen, it should serve as a massive wake-up call. When weapons of war are unleashed, it's far too often innocent civilians that will suffer the most. Still, there will be many to seize this tragedy for political gain in Ukraine, in Russia, and here in the United States. Again, people are taking the wrong lessons and calling for more confrontation when they should be calling for de-escalation. Now, the situation on the ground is changing by the minute, so please refer to the scroll below for the latest updates. Let's take heed of the sensitive nature of this calamity. Let's wait until the facts are revealed, because right now, all we can do is mourn for the victims that died and make a much more concerted effort of reining in state-sponsored instruments of death worldwide.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do, because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire untold. These ones are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in, cause we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
So amidst the barrage of bad news this week, there's at least one story out of California that restores my hope in humanity. The U.S. federal judge ruled California's death penalty as unconstitutional. In the landmark ruling, Judge Cormac Carney cited the dysfunctional system through which capital punishment is administered in the state as the basis for his decision. Anti-death penalty activists are celebrating the ruling, especially given the immense scrutiny over the practice in recent months. Earlier this summer, there was a story of a botched execution in Oklahoma, where witnesses said that the victim convulsed and thrashed on the gurney, clearly in excruciating pain. The problem stemmed from the state using a new lethal drug for the first time. It's unclear how long the man suffered the effects before dying, as officials quickly blocked the view of the execution room when the problem became evident. Following this high-profile mishap, the U.S. went a full 7 weeks without a state-mandated killing. But botched executions are only the tip of the iceberg. Last April, I reported on a 30-year study by the University of Michigan Law School, which found that the number of innocent people on death row is actually much higher than previously estimated. The report found that 1 in 25 inmates sentenced to death in the U.S. are likely innocent. And the authors of that study suggest that this is a conservative estimate. adding that quote of the group, 117 or 1.6% were exonerated. With enough time and resources, the authors concluded that at least 4.1% of them would have been exonerated. In other words, more than 200 other prisoners would have been cleared during those 3 decades. It's a shocking revelation, but it makes perfect sense considering the sheer number of prisoners sentenced to death row every year across the U.S. In fact, that there are still 32 U.S. states where the death penalty remains legal. Those are the states you see here in red. And in states like Connecticut, Maryland, and New Mexico, which have abolished the death penalty in recent years, there are still an estimated 3,088 prisoners awaiting execution, since those bans are not retroactive. But there is a silver lining. See, even though a majority of Americans still support the death penalty, that majority is shrinking. According to a Pew Research poll, the percentage of Americans who support capital punishment fell from 76% in 1996 to only 55% last year. This change in attitude and regard for human life is the backbone of the latest ruling in California, where a majority of America's death row inmates currently live. Although Judge Carney's ruling doesn't ban the death penalty outright, it's a strong indictment that will hopefully carry the weight for a statewide ban by 2016. And considering that the U.S. remains one of the only industrialized countries in the world that still carries out this barbaric practice, I think it's time we step up to the plate and start treating human life with the respect it deserves. For most of us, the threat of species extinction isn't exactly the type of thought we tend to carry in the back of our minds. But make no mistake, all around the world, the effects of climate change are causing irreparable harm to life on Earth. According to a recent UN report, climate change is doing widespread and consequential harm to animals and plants, which are struggling to adapt to new conditions. Many climate scientists agree that our rapidly changing weather will undoubtedly lead to near-term extinctions, threatening the future of our planet. This is exactly the topic of a new book called Extinction Dialogues: How to Live with Death in Mind. Earlier, I was joined by the book's co-author, former psychotherapist and professor of psychology, Carolyn Baker. I first asked her how she came to the conclusion that climate change is much, much worse than we've been taught.
Mostly the research of various climate scientists and all the research that Guy McPherson has been compiling for several years. And you know, Elizabeth Colbert's book, The Sixth Extinction in Unnatural History, in that book she says the sixth extinction is likely to be mankind's most lasting legacy. It compels us to rethink the fundamental question of what it means to be human. Now, of course, it's not only Colbert who's talking about extinction. This topic is coming up everywhere in mainstream media.
In 2009, you wrote Sacred Demise, the forecast and the collapse of industrial civilization. What driving forces are behind this ultimate downfall?
Well, human beings' inability to really look at the problem. You know, introduction 101 to solving problems, you have to admit that you have one. And so we have most of the planet being unwilling to really look at it. And, you know, I wrote an article recently around what does it mean to do something about climate change. And there are 4 things that have to happen if we're going to do something. One is agree that climate change is actually happening. Secondly, understand that the situation is so dire that humanity's living arrangements have to be radically altered, sacrifice our economic security and industrial profits to significantly reduce carbon emissions, and agree that, you know, in order to avoid the next 2-degree rise in temperature, which is becoming increasingly lethal, we do have to change our living arrangements radically. And that's not likely to happen.
Ultimately, the purpose of your book, Carolyn, isn't to scare the hell out of people, but it's a wake-up call so that people can find meaning in the collapse, prepare emotionally. Elaborate on why that's so important.
Well, you know, one of the things that we sort of talk about in there is the hospice model, you know, and the possibility that our planet may actually be in a state of hospice. And what do you do when, you know, you have a terminal diagnosis and you've admitted yourself to hospice? You know, a lot of people think, oh my God, that's the worst thing that could happen. But many people report who have been in hospice that, you know, it was one of the most fulfilling times of their lives because they got to really deal deeply reflect and look at their lives and repair relationships. And, you know, for us, we're asking questions like, how can I be more loving? What can I do to serve fellow humans and the more than human world? How can I create beauty and joy? And I know that as an artist, you know how much this matters. And in short, the whole question is, how can I live more passionately, more compassionately, and increase a sense of meaning and purpose in my own life and the lives of others?
Carolyn, one of the most important messages that you advocate for is that need to strengthen our ties as a community, getting to know our neighbors, sharing, learning from one another, building these relationships. Why did we lose this sense of community, and how can we reroot ourselves in it?
Well, we lost it through, it goes way back, I think, to the Enlightenment and the whole sense of reason as primary. And, you know, when you go down that road, you know, that reason is the end all and be all, then you start losing feelings. And when you start losing feelings and emotion, you stop connecting with people, and you start viewing yourself as separate from people and other beings. And so I think since that period of time, 17th, 18th century, we've become extremely individualistic. You know, it's me and mine, and to hell with you over there and what you need. And so one of the things that is positive about all of the crises that we are in is that it has the potential to really drive us together to support and help one another.
Carolyn, you're of course encouraging your readers to resist, become activists, get in that community sense. I guess what I'm struggling with, and I know a lot of other people who might be watching this also are, is how can we bridge this feeling of just utter hopelessness and lack of control with the future and harness that toward tangible action for the here and now?
Well, one of the things that I think is really important is to understand that what Guy and I are not saying is, you know, get on your favorite pair of pajamas and go to bed and go to sleep. We're not saying that at all. You know, Guy is often quotes Edward Abbey, who said, if you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, then do. And I recently wrote an article, which you can find on my website at carolynbaker.net, entitled "When Surrender Means Not Giving Up." And in that article, I argued that rather than trying to do something about a phenomenon that cannot be fixed, in the face of what increasingly appears to be the sixth great extinction, we focus on living our lives in a particular way that brings meaning to ourselves and others. Even more important now to connect with other people and to be of service and to spend quality time in nature and appreciate the hell out of our lives.
Absolutely. Well said. Yeah, exactly. Cultivate that artistic nature, provide things that will make people happy. Art, music, philosophy, conversation. Carolyn, a few months ago, our mutual good friend Mike Rupert tragically took his own life. As someone who was very close to Mike, what can we learn from his approach to seeking truth and I guess gain from his wisdom?
Well, we can have compassion for people who are very troubled. And we can reach out to them as much as possible, and we can realize that they're there, but for the grace of something or other go all of us. It could have been any of us. You know, everyone has a right to take their own life, but I still think it's tragic when somebody leaves us so soon when they have so much to offer. So if we can have more compassion, if we can strengthen those ties with each other, then very often we can prevent an early demise.
And Mike Rupert definitely had no shortage of passion and compassion.
Oh, yeah.
Carolyn Baker, yes. Psychotherapist, professor, author of Extinction Dialogues, How to Live with Death in Mind. Always amazing to hear your insight, Carolyn.
Thank you, Abby.
Coming up, I'll discuss alternatives to the West's global banking monopoly. Stay tuned.
Yeah, I take no prisoners, you call it aggressive, but all I see is lies coming out in your message. I keep it audacious, speaking the facts. We break the paradigm with truth intact. The people don't need to be fed propaganda, spoon-fed fabrications and slander. What we need is to question more and to keep it up.
Are you like me? You want your comedy news with some teeth? Want your comedy news to be a bare-fisted, no-holds-barred fight to the death? like a truth vampire biting into the necks of the corporate elite and the billionaire freaks while they're going, make it stop! Well, that's what you get with my new show, Redacted Tonight.
Is that too much? I think that's too much.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
The media, the candidates, the corporatocracy, covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA? Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
Well, as the World Cup wrapped up this week, a different international meeting was taking place in Brazil as the BRICS nations held their 6th annual summit. Representing 18% of the global economy, the BRIC nations, comprising of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, first came together in 2009, with South Africa joining 1 year later. The group convenes to address the issues facing the global south as well as emerging markets and pursue a shared prosperity among each nation's fast-growing economies. And the most remarkable outcome of this week's summit was the creation of the new development bank, created as an alternative to the existing international loan sharks, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The bank has received a total of $50 million in capital, with each BRICS country contributing $10 billion. Low-income countries are encouraged to apply to the bank for loans to fund their development projects. So here to discuss the recent BRICS summit, I'm joined by Vijay Prashad, author of The Poor Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. Thank you so much for coming on, Vijay.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I want to begin by getting your response to the new deal announced by the BRICS on Monday. What role do you think the new development bank will play, and will it be a viable alternative to the IMF and World Bank?
Well, the first thing to say is that it's good news and it's not so good news. It's good news because it's a challenge to the kind of suffocated international economic system that was produced after World War II, when the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, institutions dominated largely by the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, laid the agenda for development in most of the world. So this is a frontal challenge to the IMF and the World Bank. That's a very productive and good development. The other thing that's very good is, despite the fact that China has such an enormously larger economy than South Africa or Brazil, the way the new BRICS Development Bank is going to be organized, each of the BRICS country will have the same vote, which is very different from how the International Monetary Fund is organized, where the countries that are the largest contributors dominate the decision-making of the IMF. So in terms of global democracy, this is a very important advance. There's a little bit of a limitation, or I would say I hesitate to smile too widely. The first limitation is that they've decided to denominate their holdings in dollars. You know, for a long time there was a thought that perhaps the yuan would be used as the main currency of the BRICS Development Bank, or that they would use a basket of currencies. But they've gone with the dollar. And for very many reasons, this is a terrible idea.
And Vijay, why do you think, really quickly, why do you think that they did that? And how do you think Western powers will respond to a competitor with the global banking monopoly?
Well, you know, already periodicals like The Economist have yawned a little, saying, well, yes, there's a new bank in town, great, but they're going to use the dollar. So where's the real challenge to the global order? And I think to some extent they're right. I think this would have been a very useful place for the yuan to have been put forward as a significant challenge. you know, there's already something called the dim sum bond. In fact, McDonald's has floated dim sum bonds. These are bonds of yuan held outside China. It would have been an interesting possibility to have at least floated the idea of a yuan-dollar combination for their holdings, but they went with the dollar. And it tells you a little bit about the lack of courage among the BRICS countries at this point.
I want to talk particularly about India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first appearance at the BRICS summit since his election in May. According to the Times of India, Modi promised he would, quote, invest heavily in infrastructure, affordable housing, healthcare, education, and clean energy, while emphasizing sustainability has been a core element of the Indian way of life. What do you make of these promises, considering that Modi really represents the neoliberal BJP party in India?
Well, you know, to get elected in India, you have to make enormous promises. It's a functioning democracy, it's a flourishing democracy. In fact, Modi made the slogan that toilets should come before temples. You know, you'll be surprised to know, Abby, that in India, 50% of the population, 1.3 billion people, defecate in public. You know, that's the largest number of people in any country that have no access to toilets. And, you know, when you look at the promises a government makes, the best way to actually adjudicate whether they live up to their promise is not by listening to their rhetoric, but by looking at their budget. And the first budget that the BJP has put forward is actually, you know, revealing of their true intentions. It's more bullet trains and less sanitation. So obviously they have rhetoric to get elected, but when it came to how they want to disburse the people's money to create a new India, I'm afraid they're not as imaginative towards people's needs as they claim in their rhetoric.
In terms of the recent developments in Israel and Palestine, BRICS has not called out Israeli aggression in Gaza, but did call on the two parties to resume talks and negotiate a two-state solution. What do you think the BRICS could do to add teeth to their commitment to peace?
Well, you know, the BRICS has since 2009, before South Africa joined, and then in all the other 5 meetings before this one, the BRICS has said that it's very important for multilateralism to be the framework of international diplomacy, not unipolarity, where the United States essentially drives an agenda. And in light of that, they've said in each of the declarations, the BRICS countries need to have an active role in the Israel-Palestine, or rather the Middle East peace dialogue. Unfortunately, in this declaration, in the middle of a murderous bombing campaign against Gaza, the BRICS countries basically reiterated what they've said since 2009. What we didn't see was a direct statement condemning the violence and calling for a ceasefire. That would have been actually quite important to have had the 5 BRICS countries from Brazil make a statement about a ceasefire. It strikes me as a very odd thing that, you know, many of the BRICS countries, especially Russia and China, have felt betrayed by the way the West handled the situation in Libya with Resolution 1973, where the West said we need a no-fly zone and we need to get a strong Chapter 7 resolution out of the United Nations. Russia and China said we've been betrayed by this resolution. I would have thought that in the past 10 days, at some point, the Russians or the Chinese would have written a resolution calling for a no-fly zone, calling for responsibility to protect, knowing full well that the American ambassador Samantha Power would veto that resolution. It's about time to aggressively put the Americans on the back foot on the question of supporting Israel. And this didn't happen in Brazil during the BRICS summit, and it certainly didn't happen today when the United Nations Security Council had an emergency session on Gaza.
Well, why do you think it didn't? Because, I mean, if not now, when, Vijay?
Well, this is an excellent question, and I don't have the answer to that question. The only thing I can say is I feel that there is yet a lack of confidence. You know, there is a sense that the world is changing. There is a sense that US hegemony is fraying. There's an understanding that the Americans don't dominate, you know, the global institutions in the way they used to, and yet there is a lack of confidence. It is going to take, I think, some time for these countries to no longer look behind, behind their shoulder. They need to look ahead. They need to put forward an alternative policy framework, and they haven't done that yet.
Right, because this one certainly isn't working for the long term, Vijay. And I mean, this week, members of the Indian parliament actually staged a walkout when the government refused to hear a resolution condemning Israeli raids in Gaza. Talk about the shift and rift in Indian politics over the conflict so far.
This has been a long time coming. You know, India didn't recognize Israel till 1991, and in the past 20-odd years, India has become closer and closer to Israel. In fact, today, India is the largest importer of Israeli arms. You know, India is anyway the largest importer of arms in the world, but India imports half of the arms that Israel exports. This has brought the countries into a certain kind of harmony. And the BJP, the right-wing party that's currently in power, is very close to the Israelis. So the statements coming out of the Indian Foreign Ministry have been extremely bloodless, you know, calling on both sides, etc. And what this creates in the country is a great feeling of dissatisfaction, because just as in Europe, the population is decidedly on the side of the Palestinians, but the governments seem to be increasingly in the thrall of the Israeli narrative. And which is why the foreign minister, for the first time in India's history, quite disgracefully, refused to allow a debate in Parliament on the question of Gaza. You know, nobody's even talking about changing the government's position on Gaza. She didn't even allow a debate. And that's really quite shocking, that something as basic as parliamentary debate was disallowed on the question of this murderous bombing campaign in Gaza.
We have about a minute left, but what do you recommend? And I guess break down kind of how many people in the Indian parliament are allied, I guess, with Gaza and Israel. How likely is it that anything can move forward with this resolution, Vijay?
You know, I think around the world there is a kind of Palestine fatigue that's developed. There are very small sections of hardcore people who understand the misery that the Palestinians suffer. But these are very small numbers of people, you know, whether it's in the United States, in Western Europe, in Africa, in Mexico, where there was a big demonstration today. These are yet very small numbers of people. We have to fight very hard to break the wall of Palestine fatigue. And we have to demonstrate to people that liberation for the Palestinians is a tangible goal. It can happen. It's not simply something that one does as a kind of habit.
Exactly.
It's real. It's absolutely possible.
Thank you for breaking through the rhetoric. Vijay Prashad, author of Poor Nations. Always amazing to hear your insight.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching, you guys. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Abby Martin. Have a great weekend. I'll be back next week to break the set all over again.